Michael moved into our quiet neighborhood and seemed like a friendly, cheerful, completely normal guy. He loved cats, always wore a big smile, and was the kind of neighbor everyone liked. But a few weeks later, Look, I'm not the kind of person who usually talks about my private life online, but there's something that's been sitting with me for years, and it just doesn't go away. You think you know the place where you live. You think you know the people who live right across the driveway or share a property line with you. But after you hear this, you might look at your own neighbors a little bit differently. I know I do. Every time I see someone smiling and waving from their yard, part of my brain goes back to that year. It all started so completely ordinary, just a normal guy, a normal street, and a normal house. But the way it ended still keeps me up some nights, even now, years later, trying to make sense of things I'll never get answers to. To give you some context, this all went down back in 2019. I had just graduated from college, and I was stuck in that weird, frustrating limbo that pretty much every recent grad goes through. I was actively looking for a decent internship or an entry-level job, which basically meant my entire day revolved around refreshing job boards. Because of that, I spent a ridiculous amount of time at home. I was pretty much on my own most of the day, left with my laptop, a gaming console, and way too much free time. My daily routine was pretty repetitive. I'd wake up, drink some coffee, and spend hours sending out resumes, tweaking cover letters, and filling out online applications. Once I got sick of looking at job descriptions, I'd usually switch over to playing video games, watching TV, or just scrolling through my phone. Sometimes I'd go out occasionally to clear my head, but for the most part, I was anchored to my desk, right by the front window. When you sit in the same spot for hours, looking out at the same street, you naturally start to notice the rhythms of the neighborhood. You learn exactly what time the mail truck comes and which cars belong to which houses. The neighborhood itself was a pretty quiet suburban spot just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. It was the kind of peaceful environment where nothing ever really happened. It was mostly made up of families, retired couples, and people who generally minded their own business. Everyone kept their lawns cut, parked neatly, and kept to themselves. It wasn't the type of place where people were constantly throwing block parties, but it was safe. If you passed someone while taking out the trash, you'd give them a polite nod, and that was about it. It was completely unremarkable, which was exactly why I liked it. It was just a boring, quiet place to relax while I figured out the next step in my life. The house right next door had been sitting empty for a few months. The previous tenants had moved out, and the property management company had spent a few weeks doing basic maintenance, painting the trim, mowing the grass, and putting up a "for rent" sign. From my desk by the window, I'd see the occasional real estate agent pull up, show a couple around the property, and then lock up and leave. It became just another part of the background scenery I looked at every day. That changed on a Tuesday morning near the start of the summer. I was sitting at my computer, halfway through writing a cover letter, when I heard the heavy air brakes of a large vehicle hiss right outside. I looked out the window and saw a big moving truck backing slowly into the driveway next door. It took a minute to guide the massive truck all the way up the pavement until it stopped just a few feet from the side garage door. Two guys in uniforms jumped out, walked around to the back, and rolled up the heavy metal shutter door with a loud clatter. I watched them pull down the aluminum ramp and start unloading boxes and furniture. It was all pretty standard stuff. Cardboard boxes taped shut, a mattress wrapped in plastic, some wooden chairs, and a few pieces of heavy furniture covered in moving blankets. They didn't seem to be in any rush, just carrying the items one by one up the driveway and through the side door of the house. I remember sitting there for a moment, resting my chin on my hand, just watching them work. After months of that place being completely dark and quiet, it was interesting to realize that someone new was finally moving in. I wondered briefly what kind of person was going to be living just a few feet away from my window, but I figured I'd find out soon enough. The movers took a few more hours to finish up. Every now and then, between tailoring my resume for entry-level roles, I'd glance out the window to track their progress. It was better than just staring at job boards all day. Around noon, a clean, mid-sized silver SUV pulled into the driveway right behind the moving truck, and a man stepped out. I figured this had to be the guy moving in. He looked to be somewhere in his mid-50s, average height and build, with absolutely nothing striking about him. He wore typical suburban dad clothes, khaki shorts, a polo shirt, and clean sneakers. His hair was short, neatly combed, and turning gray at the temples. As soon as he got out, he smiled warmly at the movers and immediately started chatting with them, gesturing with his hands and laughing a little louder than he probably needed to. He seemed healthy and full of energy. Watching him from my desk, he just looked like an ordinary guy who was really eager to make friends. By late afternoon, the moving truck finally left, and the street went back to its usual quiet routine. Around 4 o'clock, I walked down the driveway to check the mailbox. As I was pulling out a stack of junk mail, I heard footsteps next door and looked up to see the new neighbor heading down his driveway toward me. He had noticed me from his porch and wanted to introduce himself. He had a massive smile and seemed incredibly eager to talk. "Hey there," he said, holding out his hand. "I'm Michael, just moving into the place next door." I shook his hand and told him my name was Lucas. "Great to meet you, Lucas," Michael said, his voice loud and cheerful. "I'm finally getting the big furniture inside, though I've still got a total mountain of boxes waiting for me. Seriously, I think I packed things I haven't looked at in 10 years. He laughed heavily at his own joke, a bit longer than necessary, before continuing. "It's a beautiful neighborhood you guys have here. Really quiet." I told him it definitely was, and that people mostly kept to themselves, but it was a good area. "That's exactly what I was looking for," he said, nodding so much his whole upper body moved. "A little peace and quiet. So do you live around here full-time, or are you just visiting?" I explained that I had recently graduated from college and was stuck at home trying to find an internship or a job. Michael listened closely, nodding along to every word. "Oh man, I remember those days," he said, letting out another big laugh. "The job hunt is tough right after graduation, but you seem like a smart guy, Lucas. I'm sure you'll land something great soon." He gave me a supportive tap on the shoulder, a little overly familiar for someone I just met, but clearly well-meaning. "Anyway, I won't keep you. I should probably get back to dealing with that disaster in my living room. It was really nice meeting you, Lucas. If I'm ever making too much noise, just come over and let me know, all right?" I told him I would, and he headed back up his driveway with a quick, energetic stride. A couple of days later, on a Thursday afternoon, we crossed paths again. I was stepping out onto the front porch to run a few quick errands when I saw Michael kneeling by the flower beds near his porch, pulling up weeds. When he heard my screen door click shut, he stood up right away, wiped his muddy hands on his shorts, and called out to ask how I was doing. I waved and said I was just heading out for a bit. "Nice day for it," Michael said, waving back with his bright smile. "Hey, quick question for you since you know the area. I'm starving and looking to grab something easy for dinner later tonight. Is there a decent burger joint or a good local diner around here that you'd recommend?" I told him about a small, family-owned tavern about 5 minutes down the road that made incredible burgers. Michael got super excited, pulled out his phone, and insisted I spell the name out so he could type it into his maps. He thanked me at least 3 times before finally heading back to his yard work. It was an incredibly ordinary, casual conversation. But as I backed my car out of the driveway and started driving down the street, this weird, subtle feeling started to creep into the back of my mind. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, and it was honestly annoying. Something about his whole vibe just felt slightly off, but I couldn't explain why. He hadn't done a single thing wrong. He didn't say anything weird, he didn't stare, and he didn't cross any lines. By all accounts, he seemed perfectly fine. As I sat at a red light, I realized I had this lingering sense of discomfort, like a heavy feeling in my gut that just wouldn't go away. I felt completely ridiculous. I told myself I was just being paranoid because I spent all my time cooped up inside, staring out the window. I was probably just overanalyzing a normal interaction because I didn't have enough going on in my own life. Anyone else on the block would probably love having him as a neighbor. When I got back home later that evening, I saw the lights on in his house, casting a normal glow onto the driveway. Michael had been nothing but polite and encouraging to me from the second he moved in. There was absolutely no logical reason for me to feel uneasy. Yet, as I locked my front door and walked down the hallway, I couldn't shake the persistent feeling that something about him was just wrong. I didn't know what it was, and I had zero proof, but the discomfort refused to go away. A few weeks went by like that, into the middle of summer. My life didn't change much, still sending out resumes, but Michael completely settled into the neighborhood. He became a regular fixture on our street. Whenever I went out to get the mail, he'd be out there mowing his lawn, always ready with an energetic wave and a loud, "Hey Lucas." We'd exchange quick small talk about the heat or the job hunt. Honestly, after a while, that initial weird feeling I had about him started to fade. He was just an outgoing guy who liked to talk a lot, and you get used to that kind of neighbor. Then, around the 3rd week of July, I noticed the first cat. I was sitting at my window desk when Michael pulled into his driveway. When he opened the driver's side door, he leaned across the passenger seat, scooped something up into his arms, and cradled it against his chest. Walking toward his front door, I saw it was an ordinary orange tabby. It looked a little scruffy and thin, like a stray. Michael was looking down at it, talking to it in a soft, comforting voice, and gently scratching behind its ears. I remember thinking it was a nice gesture. A lot of people would just ignore a stray, but Michael looked genuinely happy to help. He carried it right inside his house, and that was that. Over the next couple of weeks, though, I started noticing more cats around his property. It became a regular thing. One afternoon, I'd see a dark black cat sitting on his front porch railing. A few days later, there'd be a fluffy calico sleeping under the bushes near his driveway. Some clearly looked like strays, thin and cautious, but others looked completely different. I saw a beautiful, sleek, long-haired gray cat one morning that looked perfectly groomed and well-fed, like it definitely belonged to someone nearby and had just wandered off into his yard. I didn't think anything bad about it. I just figured word had gotten out that the new guy next door was handing out free meals, and Michael really was taking care of them. He set out a couple of small plastic bowls on his side porch filled with dry food and water, refilling them every single morning. Whenever he was outside doing yard work, there would usually be at least 1 or 2 cats just hanging around his porch or lounging in the grass nearby. He treated them like they were his own pets, talking to them while he worked, saying things like, "Hey buddy, you hungry?" or just murmuring to them while he gave them a quick pet. It was honestly kind of endearing. Seeing a guy being that kind and patient with animals makes you automatically assume he's a good person, and the hesitation I felt mostly faded during those weeks. Still, even though his behavior made him seem genuinely kind, A small, unexplained feeling stayed stuck in the back of my mind, even if I couldn't find a single logical reason to justify it. But out of all the different cats that started showing up next door, there was one specific cat that really stood out. It was a medium-sized cat with patchy gray and white fur, yellow-green eyes, and a noticeably ragged, torn left ear. What made this cat stand out wasn't its looks, though. It was how Michael treated it compared to the others. He seemed completely attached to this one. While the other cats would just eat his food and wander off into the woods or down the street, this gray and white one was always right by his side. Whenever Michael sat out on his porch in the evenings, that cat would be curled up directly in his lap, and Michael would just sit there for an hour, stroking its back and talking to it quietly. It followed him around the yard like a dog while he pulled weeds or checked his mail. It wasn't doing anything weird. It was just incredibly loyal to him, and Michael clearly favored it over any other cat that came around. Around the first week of August, a random thought popped into my head while I was working on a job application. It was just a passing realization. I was looking out at Michael's empty porch steps, and I realized I hadn't seen that orange tabby, the very first cat he brought home, in weeks. Then I started thinking about the fluffy calico and that groomed gray one. I distinctly remembered watching them walk up his driveway over the past month, but now that I thought about it, I couldn't recall seeing them around lately at all. I didn't think anything sinister of it. Cats are independent, wandering animals. I just figured they ate their fill, got bored, and wandered off to a different block, or went back home to their actual owners. It just struck me as a little funny that so many cats went over there, but I couldn't remember seeing many of them again afterward. That evening the sun was setting, casting long shadows across our driveways. As the evening light was fading, I happened to glance outside from my desk again. Michael was sitting out on his front porch in a green lawn chair, completely relaxed. The gray and white cat with the ragged ear was curled up right on his lap, resting quietly. Michael was murmuring something to it, casually stroking its head, while the cat quietly looked out at the empty street. I remember thinking about how many different cats had cycled through his yard over the last few weeks, coming and going. Yet, no matter what, this specific gray and white one never left his side. It was always right there, just hanging around. It didn't make me scared or even suspicious, just mildly curious about where all the other ones went, and why this particular cat had chosen to stay. By the time August wrapped up and we crawled into September, the summer heat finally started to break. My daily schedule hadn't changed. I was still blasting out resumes every single day and waiting for calls. Michael had fully become a staple of the block by then, just part of the background scenery. Whenever I stepped outside, there he was, usually doing some yard project or washing his SUV. And right there with him, every single time, was that gray and white cat with the ragged ear. It was like his shadow. That initial, weird gut feeling I'd had about him when he first moved in had mostly settled into a quiet background noise. He was just the friendly guy next door who really liked cats, and the cats just kept coming. Now that the word was clearly out that Michael's side porch was an all-you-can-eat buffet, new cats showed up on his property almost every week. I started noticing their individual faces because I looked out my front window so much. Around the second week of September, a distinctive tuxedo cat with 3 black legs and 1 perfectly white front paw started hanging around his bushes. A couple of days later, a long-haired tortoiseshell cat with a bright red collar appeared, lounging on his porch steps. Some were clearly strays, skinny and skittish, but others, like the tortoiseshell one, looked perfectly healthy and well-groomed. Obviously someone's indoor-outdoor pets from a few streets over. But after a while, a strange pattern started to form, and it became pretty hard for me to ignore, even though I tried to. I'd see a new cat show up, like that tuxedo one with the white paw, eating out of the bowls, or sleeping under Michael's side porch for a day or two straight. Then it would just be gone, and I would literally never see it again. At first, I didn't think twice about it. I mentally dismissed it, reinforcing the thought that cats are nomadic creatures. But then, a completely white, fluffy cat showed up, stayed for a brief moment, and vanished. A few days later, a striped tabby did the exact same thing. The thought kept bouncing back into my head, no matter how many times I brushed it off. None of these cats ever became regulars, except for the gray and white one with the ragged ear. Right around the middle of September, I was sitting on my couch in the evening, casually scrolling through a local community Facebook page for our suburb. As I swiped down, a post caught my eye. Someone living about 3 blocks over had posted a picture of a missing tortoiseshell cat with a red collar. The owner wrote that she had slipped out of the house 2 days ago and hadn't returned. I stopped scrolling and stared at the photo. It looked exactly like the one I'd seen sitting on Michael's porch steps earlier that very same week. To be fair, I didn't immediately connect Michael to anything bad. My first rational thought was just that the poor cat must have gotten lost, wandered over to Michael's house for some food, and then kept running. I figured his yard was just a temporary pit stop for lost pets before they kept moving on. Meanwhile, the gray and white cat with the ragged ear was a permanent fixture. It never went missing, and it never left the property. I saw it constantly. If Michael went down to his mailbox, the cat would trot right beside his sneakers, sitting down patiently while he grabbed his letters. I started noticing that Michael had this incredibly intense, almost obsessive attachment to this specific cat. It wasn't creepy, just kind of quirky. One afternoon, I saw him walking around his backyard carrying the cat in his arms like a baby, talking to it continuously. He'd sit on his porch swing for hours in the fading evening light, stroking its back while it rested quietly on his lap. It was clear that while Michael treated all the neighborhood cats like guests, this ragged-eared one was his absolute priority. He treated it more like a human companion than a pet. The turning point happened on a rainy Tuesday night near the end of the month. I was winding down for bed, sitting at my desk, and opened up the neighborhood app on my phone just to check the local updates. Right at the top of the feed was a brand new post from a user who lived just 1 street over from us. The heading read, "Missing pet, please help." I clicked on it, and my stomach did a weird, cold little flip. The attached picture was a clear photo of a tuxedo cat. It had a black coat, a white chest, and one very specific feature: 3 black legs and 1 perfectly white front paw. The owner wrote that he had failed to come home just 2 nights prior, and the family was desperate to find him. I sat there in the dark, the glow of my phone screen lighting up my face, staring at that white paw in the picture. I distinctly remembered watching that exact cat eating from the bowls on Michael's side porch only 3 days earlier. The timeline locked into place in my head, and it felt way too close for comfort. I tried to tell myself the same things I'd been saying for weeks, reasoning that the lost cat simply found Michael's food and then wandered off into the woods. There were 100 logical, completely normal explanations for why a cat would disappear from a neighborhood. I wasn't about to accuse my next-door neighbor of anything weird just because he fed stray cats. But as I turned off my phone and looked out into the dark rain toward the silent house next door, I couldn't stop the thought from creeping in. For the first time, it felt like too much of a pattern. I couldn't help but wonder if all these sudden disappearances were really just a massive coincidence, or if something else was happening right outside my window. October brought a noticeable chill to the air, and the leaves were finally starting to drop. But my personal situation hadn't progressed much. I was still caught in that exhausting cycle of polishing cover letters and hitting submit on job boards. I'd actually managed to clear the first couple of rounds for a few decent entry-level positions lately, but they all ended in standard rejection emails. The constant waiting was wearing me down, leaving me with a lot of restless energy as I sat at my window desk day after day. Next door, Michael seemed completely unfazed by the changing seasons. He spent his mornings out in the yard, raking leaves, clearing his gutters, and keeping up with the maintenance of his property like clockwork. While things felt stagnant for me, the neighborhood social media pages were picking up. Over the next few weeks, more missing cat posts popped up on the local Facebook group and the community app. It wasn't an overwhelming flood, just a steady trickle you wouldn't notice unless you were paying attention. One day, it was a ginger cat from 2 blocks over. A week later, someone posted about a sleek black cat that went missing near the park. Having nothing but time, I stared at the photos and my stomach sank when I recognized a couple of them. I distinctly remembered seeing that ginger cat sniffing around Michael's side porch a few days before the post went up. It was the same story with the black one. I'd watched it eating from Michael's food bowls just a week prior. That was when my casual observing started to turn into something more conscious. I wouldn't call it spying or investigating. I wasn't hiding behind the curtains, but I definitely found myself paying closer attention whenever I glanced outside. I started keeping a running mental log of the cats that showed up next door, tracking how many days they stuck around and when they stopped showing up. I became hyper-aware of the small food and water bowls sitting out on his side porch. Every time Michael went out to refill them, my eyes automatically drifted toward his yard. I wanted to see which cats were currently using his place as a pit stop and which ones had moved on. It became a habit driven entirely by the fact that the pattern was becoming way too obvious to ignore. I actually ended up mentioning it to him one afternoon. I was out raking a few stray leaves near the edge of our driveways when Michael walked out onto his side porch with a massive bag of dry food. I leaned on my rake and called out, "Hey Michael, you've really got a whole operation going over there. I swear half the cats in Charlotte have figured out your address." Michael paused, letting out a loud, good-natured laugh as he poured the kibble into the plastic bowls. "Oh, you aren't kidding, Lucas," he replied, shaking his head with a laugh. "They just keep showing up. I guess I'm just a softie for them. If a hungry animal wanders into my yard, I can't just turn them away." The conversation was completely light and ordinary, and he went right back to tidying his porch. The frustrating part was that every time I watched Michael, he acted completely normal. There wasn't a single suspicious thing about his behavior. If I rolled the trash cans down to the curb, he'd see me and call out, "Hey Lucas, any luck on the job hunt this week?" He was always friendly, polite, and encouraging, often offering to help with yard work or property maintenance. When he was with the cats, he was just as kind. I'd watch him sit on his back steps, gently pushing a food bowl toward a skittish stray, waiting patiently for the animal to feel safe enough to eat. He never yelled, never chased them, and never did anything that looked remotely wrong. It quietly frustrated me because the pattern existed, but Michael never actually did anything out of line. And then, of course, there was the gray and white cat with the ragged ear. That cat was the one constant in the middle of all this coming and going. It was always present, lounging on the porch railing, sitting near the mailbox, or trotting right behind Michael's sneakers while he worked on his lawn. Michael's attachment to it grew more noticeable every week, showing up in little everyday habits. Instead of just shooing it away when he was busy, he'd actually pause whatever he was doing, whether it was loading groceries or fixing a lawnmower, just to hold the front door open for it or wait for it to catch up. That was when the first real question started to take root in my mind, born out of pure, nagging curiosity rather than fear. I started asking myself, if all these other cats keep disappearing, why is the ragged ear cat the only one that always stays? What made this specific cat different from the dozens of others that cycled through Michael's property? If they were all just wandering off because they got bored, why didn't this one ever leave? I didn't have an answer, and there were plenty of logical explanations. Maybe Michael had officially adopted it, or maybe it was just a lazy cat that knew it had a good thing going. But the sheer contrast between this one permanent resident and the revolving door of missing pets kept lingering in my thoughts. One evening near the end of October, the sun had already gone down, leaving a deep twilight across the neighborhood. I was sitting at my desk, the room dark except for the glare of my computer screen. I leaned back, rubbed my eyes, and happened to glance out the window. Next door, the amber porch light was on, casting soft shadows across the driveway. Michael was sitting out there on his porch swing, casually rocking back and forth with the ragged ear cat resting quietly on his lap. He was just murmuring to it, totally at peace, looking out at the quiet street. There was absolutely nothing sinister about the scene. It was just a man and his cat enjoying a crisp fall evening. But as I sat there watching him in the dark, a wave of self-awareness hit me. I realized I had started paying attention to Michael far more than I should. I still had no proof of anything, but by that point, I couldn't stop watching. By the time we rolled into early November, the autumn chill had completely set in, and the neighborhood took on a quiet, barren feel as the last of the leaves dropped. My job search was still dragging on with no real end in sight, and the constant rejections were starting to give me some pretty bad insomnia. I found myself lying awake until 2 or 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling and stressing over applications I still needed to fill out. During the day, Michael was exactly the same as he'd always been, perfectly normal, friendly, and busy with his usual household chores. But because I was spending my nights wide awake, I started noticing a completely different side of the house next door. To understand how I started hearing these things, you have to picture how our houses are set up. They're relatively close together, with only about 12 to 15 feet of concrete driveway separating my bedroom wall from the side of Michael's place. My bed was pushed right up against that exterior wall, and my window faced directly toward his side garage door. In a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Charlotte, once it hits midnight, the entire area goes completely dead silent. There's no traffic noise or sirens. When a place is that quiet, sounds carry incredibly easily, and even a small noise from next door can carry surprisingly well through the quiet night. Because of my stress and the proximity of the buildings, I could hear things I normally would have slept right through. The first time it happened was a Thursday night around 2 in the morning. I was lying in the dark, trying to force myself to sleep, when a sudden, heavy thump vibrated through the wall. It sounded like something solid dropping directly onto a hardwood floor next door. A second later, I heard the faint, rapid sound of quick footsteps moving across the room. It wasn't loud enough to wake up a normal person, but in the middle of a silent night, it stood out sharply. I sat up in bed, listening closely, but after a minute, everything went completely quiet again. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just figured Michael had dropped a heavy book or bumped into a piece of furniture in the dark. Old houses make noise, people drop things, and there was no reason to think it was anything unusual. But over the next week or two, those nighttime noises started happening more frequently. It wasn't an every night occurrence, but it happened often enough that I began to notice a real pattern. Sometimes it would be a door clicking shut firmly at 3 in the morning. Other times I would hear a distinct dragging sound, like a heavy plastic storage bin or a piece of furniture being pulled slowly across a bare floor next door. Because I was already paying so much attention to Michael and the weird pattern with the cats during the day, these sounds naturally caught my attention more than they would have in the past. I kept trying to explain it all logically, telling myself Michael was probably just a night owl who liked to do his cleaning after dark. Or maybe he was still unpacking some leftover boxes from his move-in. It was a little weird, sure, but plenty of people have strange sleep schedules. Then, around the middle of November, the noises took a slightly different turn. It was a Tuesday night, right around midnight, and I was sitting on the edge of my bed when I heard a muffled voice bleeding through the wall. It was Michael, and he was talking surprisingly loud inside his house. He wasn't screaming, but his voice was raised enough that fragments carried clearly through the quiet night air. I couldn't make out full sentences, but I distinctly heard him say, "Come here," followed by a brief pause. A moment later, his voice drifted through again. "Where'd you go?" And then a softer, "There you are." Hearing those words, my mind immediately found a rational explanation. Michael was incredibly attached to that gray and white cat with the ragged ear, and he was always talking to it like a person during the day. It made perfect sense that he was just chasing his favorite cat around the living room or trying to get it to come to bed. It was a completely normal thing for a pet owner to do. I kept telling myself to drop it and focus on my own life. I was letting my frustration with the job search turn me into a paranoid neighbor who overanalyzed every single thing the guy next door did. Michael was a grown man. If he wanted to stay up late, move things around, and talk to his cat at 2 a.m, that was his business. He was still the exact same polite, smiling neighbor whenever I saw him out in the driveway during the day, so there was absolutely no reason to think anything malicious was going on. I forced myself to look for the most boring, realistic explanations possible because I didn't want to be the kind of person who jumped to wild conclusions without a single shred of actual evidence. But the mind has a weird way of hyper-focusing on things once a pattern sets in. One night, very late, probably closer to 3 a.m, the neighborhood was totally dark and silent. I was lying perfectly still in bed, right on the edge of finally drifting off to sleep, when that familiar dragging sound started up next door. It was slow and heavy, moving across the floor right on the other side of my bedroom wall. I held my breath, listening as it slid along for a few seconds, followed by a sudden, loud thump that actually made my window pane rattle slightly. Then, just like before, total and absolute silence returned to the house next door. I lay there in the dark for a long time, my eyes wide open, staring at the wall. I still didn't think anything dangerous was happening, but by then, every unusual sound from next door had started getting my attention. Those thumps and dragging sounds kept happening into the middle of November, but it wasn't long before a new element got introduced. It happened on a cold, overcast Monday night around 1 a.m. I was lying awake in the dark, trying to fall asleep, when a sudden, sharp yowl cut through the silence outside. It was a startled screech, the unmistakable sound of a cat in distress. It didn't last long, maybe just a second or two, before dropping off completely. At first, my brain did what it always did and jumped right to the most logical explanation. Outdoor cats fight all the time over territory or food, and they can make some pretty horrific noises when they get into it. Since Michael was putting out so much food, his yard had become a major hub for every stray in the area. So it made perfect sense that a couple of them were having a fight out by his bushes. I figured it was just nature doing its thing, dismissed it, and just tried to drift off. The problem was, it didn't just happen that one time. Over the next week or so, those brief, sharp cat cries happened a handful of times, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. What really started bothering me was the acoustics of it. They weren't echoing from out in the yard or down the street. The sounds were muffled and clearly coming from somewhere deep inside Michael's house. The timing locked in way too perfectly with the other noises, too. I'd be lying there and hear heavy footsteps pacing across his floor, followed by the sound of an interior door clicking shut, and then, a moment later, that quick, startled screech or a loud cat cry. It was never a constant, prolonged wailing. It was always just a single, isolated cry that would cut right through the quiet, followed by a total return to silence. There was still no actual proof of anything bad, but the precise correlation between Michael moving around his house and these sudden cat cries started to make me feel increasingly uneasy. Around that same time, I started hearing Michael's voice drifting through the wall again during these late-night episodes. He wasn't shouting or sounding angry. His tone was still incredibly calm, smooth, and conversational, which almost made it feel more unusual given the hour. One night, right around 2:30 in the morning, his voice bled through the drywall so clearly I could follow along with the cadence. I sat up in bed and listened to the low, steady murmur. "Come on, don't be scared," I heard him say. There was a brief pause, a faint shuffling sound, and then he continued, "Come on, easy. There you go, good." The whole exchange lasted less than a minute before slipping back into silence. I tried to tell myself he was just talking to the ragged ear cat, which felt normal enough, but because it was happening alongside those muffled thumps and pacing footsteps, it stayed heavily in my mind. By then, I was starting to argue with myself about it. I would spend hours lying there in the dark, literally having a back and forth in my own head. One side of me said I was just a paranoid, obsessive lunatic. I was an unemployed guy with way too much free time, letting my own frustration turn a perfectly friendly neighbor into a villain. Michael was always great to me during the day. He was well liked on the block, and there was no logical reason to think he was doing anything wrong. But then the other side of my brain would speak up, just a persistent, nagging feeling that something about this setup was totally wrong. The vanishing cats, the missing pet posts on Facebook, the late-night dragging sounds, and now these muffled cries. It was all stacking up into a pile of coincidences that was getting way too high to ignore. I felt completely stuck between my rational logic and a growing gut instinct. Everything came to a head on a freezing Thursday night near the end of November. I was lying perfectly still when I heard that familiar dragging sound start up right on the other side of my bedroom wall, followed by some rapid, heavy movement. Immediately after, a cat let out a loud, desperate cry, a raw, terrified screech. But right in the middle of the screech, the cry was suddenly cut short, ending in an abrupt, heavy thump, and then sudden silence. That silence bothered me far more than the actual sound did. It felt incredibly unsettling. I sat up in bed, my heart racing in the dark, just staring at the blank wall. I didn't investigate, and I didn't leave the house. I just sat there, completely frozen, realizing that for the first time, I genuinely couldn't find a way to explain it away. I eventually lay back down, but I didn't close my eyes for the rest of the night. Staring at the pale morning light slowly creeping through my blinds, I had to finally admit it to myself. I still had no actual proof of anything, and I wasn't about to go making crazy accusations against Michael. But as I lay awake in bed, seriously considering that something might be happening inside his house that I didn't understand, the casual curiosity was completely gone, replaced by a genuine, deep-seated concern. December arrived, bringing a hard freeze that kept everyone on our block firmly indoors. The suburban streets were completely empty by 5 o'clock, but my focus had narrowed entirely down to the house right next door. Ever since that night at the end of November, when that cat's cry was suddenly cut short, I couldn't look at Michael's place the same way. I wasn't just glancing out the window anymore. I was actively paying attention to every single detail of his daily schedule, trying to find some piece of information that would make the situation make sense again. My habits on the local neighborhood apps changed too. I found myself refreshing the community pages multiple times a day, specifically looking for the lost and found sections. In the first week of December, another missing cat post popped up, and my stomach completely sank. A family living on the next street over posted a picture of a distinctive Siamese mix with bright blue eyes and dark points on its ears. The post said he'd failed to come home for dinner the night before. I stared at the screen, a cold realization locking into place. I had distinctly seen that exact Siamese mix sitting near Michael's side porch food bowls just 2 afternoons prior. At this stage, the pattern was simply impossible to ignore. It was becoming incredibly difficult to dismiss as a coincidence. Because I was paying so much closer attention, I started noticing just how much late-night activity was actually happening over there. Michael's house used to go dark around 11, but now I realized the lights in his side rooms and kitchen stayed on well past 2 or 3 in the morning. From my bedroom window, I could see the dull, warm glow filtering through his blinds, casting long, still shadows across the narrow driveway between our properties. Every once in a while, I'd see his silhouette move past the window glass, just a brief shape passing through the light, indicating he was up and actively moving around at hours when the rest of the suburb was dead silent. Knowing what I had heard through the wall just a week earlier, seeing those lights on in the middle of the night made me incredibly uneasy. Yet, during the day, the contrast was maddening. The moment that completely changed everything happened during the second week of December on a Tuesday night around 2 in the morning. The entire neighborhood was silent, buried under a heavy frost. I was lying in bed, awake, when I heard the distinct, faint sound of Michael's side garage door clicking open. I immediately stood up, walked over to my bedroom window, and looked out into the darkness. Michael stepped out of the side door, dressed in a heavy, dark winter coat. In each hand, he was carrying a large, dark, thick, utility-style bag. The bags were completely filled out, looking somewhat heavy by the way his arms were extended, but they weren't impossibly heavy for him to manage. I couldn't tell what was inside them from where I was standing, but they were clearly full. Instead of walking toward his silver SUV, parked right there in the driveway, Michael turned his back on the vehicle, walked down to the edge of the asphalt, and started heading down the sidewalk on foot, moving away from the house. Before he could even leave the property line, though, something happened that made me freeze. The gray and white cat with the ragged ear suddenly trotted out from the shadow of the porch steps, stopping right near the edge of the grass. Michael noticed the cat immediately. He stopped walking, carefully set both of the large, dark bags down on the concrete sidewalk, and crouched down on his knees right beside the cat. He reached out and gently scratched the cat behind its ears, leaning his head close to whisper something incredibly soft and affectionate to it. Then he leaned forward and gently kissed the cat right on the top of its head. He stood back up, picked up both of the heavy utility bags, and kept walking down the dark street, disappearing into the shadows beyond the streetlights. The cat didn't follow him. It just sat on the frost-covered grass, watching him walk away into the dark. It was a striking detail because during the day, that cat acted like his shadow, following him everywhere. But tonight it stayed behind, keeping watch over the empty house. I stood by my window for a long time, my pulse quickening as I watched his dark silhouette grow smaller and smaller until he completely vanished around the far corner of the block. The cold air from the window pane was seeping into the room, but I couldn't pull myself away. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just witnessed. In all the months Michael had lived next door, I had never once seen him leave the property on foot in the dead of night, let alone carrying large, filled utility bags down the street. Every single rational explanation I'd used to protect my peace of mind over the last few weeks felt completely useless now. A deep, active suspicion took over completely. I seriously considered putting on my shoes and following him right then and there. I ultimately stayed inside that night, but the decision was already locked in. I knew I couldn't just sit behind my glass window guessing anymore. If Michael slipped out of the house again in the middle of the night, I was going to find out where he was going. 3 nights later, it happened again. Around 2:30 on a Friday morning, I heard the low metallic click of Michael's side garage door opening. Peeking through a gap in my blinds, I saw him walking out onto the frosted driveway in his heavy winter coat, carrying those same 2 large, dark utility bags. Like before, I had no idea what was inside them. When he turned and headed down the sidewalk on foot, bypassing his silver SUV entirely, my decision was made. I quickly threw on a jacket and sneakers, grabbed my phone, and slipped outside into the freezing December air. I waited until Michael was 3 houses down the quiet street before stepping onto the sidewalk to tail him. The spaced-out suburban streetlights left massive pockets of deep shadow, allowing me to keep a safe distance of about 40 yards without being spotted. I stayed behind cover, parked cars, thick trees, and brick mailboxes whenever he walked under a working lamp. I wasn't acting like some smooth movie detective. My hands were shaking in my pockets, my chest felt tight, and every time my shoe crunched on stray ice, I froze, terrified he would turn around and catch me. But Michael just walked steadily ahead, never checking behind him. We walked like that for 10 minutes, twisting through quiet side streets until the houses thinned out near an old neglected neighborhood park tucked into a back corner of the subdivision. During the day, it was just an overgrown plot with rusted playground equipment, cracked paths, and unkept trees. At night, with only a single flickering light near the entrance, it looked completely desolate. Michael didn't hesitate. He followed the path deep into the darker, back portion of the park, heading toward an overgrown area near a couple of large green plastic trash containers. I stopped at the park line, crouching low behind a row of bushes to keep him in sight. He set the bags down on the grass, briefly glanced toward the tree line, and calmly said, "It's here. Come and get it." It felt like a routine, completely familiar to him. Immediately afterward, Michael turned on his heel and started walking straight back down the path, heading right in my direction without waiting around. Panic hit me, and my instinct was to turn and sprint back home before he caught me. But hearing him speak toward the darkness completely caught my attention. I realized Michael was actively talking to someone, or something, waiting out there somewhere beyond the trees. That single thought completely paralyzed me, and a split-second decision took over. Curiosity pushed past my fear. Instead of following Michael back, I decided to stay hidden behind the bushes and watch the bags. I wanted to see who he was talking to, whether someone was coming out of the trees, and why the bags were left there. I pressed myself lower into the dirt, holding my breath as Michael walked past my hiding spot. He passed within 15 feet of me, his expression completely relaxed, totally unaware I was watching, and disappeared down the street. Once his footsteps faded, a heavy silence settled over the park. I stayed behind my cover, nervous and cold, debating whether to leave several times, but curiosity kept me anchored. Minutes ticked by slowly in the darkness, and nothing happened. Then, after Michael had been completely gone for several minutes, I noticed movement. A figure slowly emerged from the shadow of the trees at the far edge of the park. It was incredibly thin, looking frail and elongated. The most noticeable thing about it was a shock of long white hair hanging around its shoulders, contrasting against the dark clothing it wore. It moved with a slow, uneven pace, walking with a clear, noticeable limp as one leg dragged slightly along the ground. Its face was never clearly visible, hidden by the shadows and strands of white hair, leaving me unsure if it was human or something else. There were no supernatural features, just an unsettling, limping shape moving through the dark. It reached the trash container and stopped over the 2 utility bags, pausing before bending down low over one of them. From where I hid, the distance and lack of light made it impossible to see exactly what was inside, but what happened next was deeply disturbing. The figure bent over one of the bags and seemed to be doing something inside it, its hunched shoulders moving in an erratic, uneven way as it reached down into the plastic. I could only process what it looked like from 30 yards away, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. For the first time, all the things I'd been trying to explain away started connecting in my head. Watching that white-haired shape hunch over the bag made me understand enough to be completely horrified, even though I couldn't clearly see what it was doing. After a short time, the figure straightened up, grabbed the tops of both utility bags, and dragged them away across the grass. Its uneven, limping stride made a soft rustling sound in the quiet park as it moved toward the darker side of the property. Within a few seconds, the white hair and dark clothes slid into the pitch-black tree line, disappearing completely into the darkness. I didn't follow it. I was far too afraid to even stand up. The moment I felt it was safe, I scrambled out from behind the bushes and quietly left the park, practically sprinting back to my street. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I just needed to be behind a locked door. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see movement behind me. I slipped inside my room, closed the door behind me, and stood there for a few seconds, trying to slow my breathing. I didn't call the police, and I didn't confront Michael. I didn't tell anyone yet, because I had no idea how to phrase what I had seen without sounding completely insane. I just sat on the edge of my bed, staring blankly at the wall facing Michael's house, unable to process what had happened out there. Whatever was happening right outside my window was no longer just a collection of strange nighttime noises, missing cats, or a product of my own imagination. But looking out into the cold dark toward the silent house next door, I knew with absolute certainty that Michael was actively involved in something deeply, fundamentally wrong. Maybe 20 minutes later, I heard a knock at my front door. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. The house was completely dark, and I didn't dare make a sound. After a long pause, Michael's voice came right through the door. "Lucas," he called out softly, "you all right? I saw you outside a little earlier. You looked pretty shaken. Just wanted to make sure you're okay." I kept perfectly still and didn't answer. After a brief moment of silence, I heard his footsteps turn and move back down the porch steps. I crept over to the window and watched him calmly walk back across the driveway to his own house. I lay awake for the rest of the night, my mind spinning in circles, completely left to wonder how much he actually knew. The following morning, I decided I needed some serious distance. My sister lived in Huntersville, North Carolina, and I figured staying with her was the best way to get away from the block for a bit. I packed a quick duffel bag and left very early, hoping to avoid running into Michael entirely. Michael was nowhere to be seen, and his house was completely dark. I drove down to Huntersville and stayed at my sister's place for a couple of weeks, just trying to clear my head. When I finally returned home, Michael was still living next door, and everything appeared completely normal. That first afternoon back, he casually noticed me walking down the driveway, gave a friendly wave, and asked where I had been. I gave him a simple explanation, telling him I had been handling some family matters and visiting my sister. I kept the conversation short and polite, without going into any details. Over the next few weeks, I tried my best to settle back into my routine. The gray and white ragged-eared cat remained a constant presence around Michael's property, and I'd occasionally see it sitting near the porch, by the driveway, or lounging in the front yard. But during those weeks, I never personally saw Michael carrying those utility bags again. I never witnessed another late-night trip, and I gradually stopped paying attention as closely as I had before. More than anything, I was just exhausted. I didn't want to obsess over Michael anymore, and I no longer wanted to play detective in my own bedroom. Even if I occasionally heard something unusual at night, I generally ignored it, rolled over, and tried to sleep. Around that time, I also completely stopped checking the neighborhood Facebook groups and community apps. I didn't want to see any more missing cat posts or find myself constantly revisiting that chapter of my life. I just wanted to move forward. About a month later, I finally landed an entry-level job. The position was located in Concord, North Carolina. I desperately needed the opportunity, and it gave me a legitimate reason to leave the neighborhood behind and finally start my career. I signed a lease on a small apartment down there and decided to move out right away. While I was loading the last few boxes into my car on moving day, Michael noticed me from his yard and walked over. "Hey Lucas, looks like you're heading out for good," he said. I explained that I had landed a job down in Concord. Michael smiled, congratulated me, and wished me the best of luck with my career. After we finished talking, he headed back toward his property while I finished loading the last of my things. Right before I got into the driver's seat, I took one final look across the driveway. Michael was still outside, and the ragged ear cat was resting comfortably in his arms. He simply gave me a small wave. That was the last time I ever saw him. Years have passed since that winter. I've built a career, moved forward with my life, and even moved a couple of times since my days in Concord. My life eventually became completely normal, but every now and then, when the nights get quiet, I still find myself thinking about Michael, the utility bags, the park, and that thin, white-haired figure limping out from beyond the trees. If I had to guess, I'd say those missing cats were somehow connected to whatever I saw that night. Maybe they were even inside those bags, but that's all it's ever been, a guess. I never saw what was actually inside those bags, and I never saw Michael hurting any of those cats. I still don't know what that figure really was, and I never figured out why that ragged ear cat always stayed by Michael's side while all the others seemed to disappear. I eventually accepted that I was never going to get those answers. Life moved on. The questions never did.